Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and I'm taking care of business on Canada's podcast network. Joining me today is Phil Soper, President and CEO of Royal LePage. Thanks for joining us, Phil.
My pleasure as always, Mario.
Well, you guys put out a report today on prices in Canada. Prices are decreasing, and you expect them to continue to decrease across the country in most major markets. Can you talk a little bit about the reasoning behind that? What's happening and why are prices declining?
Sure. A little bit of context for your listeners. The market dating back to the middle of the last decade has been on some swings. If you think about the 2015 to 16 time period, it was another period like the pandemic period of uncomfortably high home price increases, up to 20-25% in some major markets. That came crashing to a halt as provinces implemented a series of new taxes to slow demand, and then there was the implementation of the national or the federal mortgage stress test. And so we had this big market correction that lasted from 2017 through to 2019, 17, 18, 19. Coming into 2020, we were looking at the strongest real estate market, well, in half a decade, since 2015. That was in the Royal LePage Outlook. Great year, 2020. People have adjusted to the stress test, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the pandemic happened. We artificially shut down the economy, transactions across the country ground to a halt, and another market correction. The reason I bring this up is what it meant was we had building demand through 4 years, 17, 18, 19, 20. People were graduating university. They were getting married, they were having babies, they were having kids leave home. All the triggers that normally cause people to look for new shelter or their first home if they're leaving their parents' home still happened, but the market wasn't accessible to them for the economic reasons we talk about. We hit the second half of 2020, policymakers have reduced the cost of money to basically zero. Money was free. Yeah. People aren't spending money on anything else. So savings are skyrocketing. And you've got 4 years of pent-up demand. So this was unleashed in an unprecedented 18 to 20 month feeding frenzy in Canadian real estate, where all these people entered the market and began looking for different accommodation. And there were other subtleties to that story, like as more and more people, or millions of people, were working from home, studying from home, they began to look for space and new accommodation. So with that many buyers, high number of buyers and constrained number of properties, prices just shot through the roof. And we hit all sorts of records, both in terms of volume and home price. And of course, these things come to an end. Our outlook, if you go back to 2020, was that the expansion, as we called it, had enough legs to last through the spring of 2022. That part of the forecast was bang on, because it did last right through to the spring of 2022. What we didn't anticipate was how much overshooting there'd be, how much excess demand and excess price appreciation, and therefore the correction that happened thereafter as the market tries to return to norm, or that mean, became a little more violent. You add on top of that monetary, the scourge of inflation and monetary policymakers tightening access to money with rising rates, and you've got a big correction in real estate markets worldwide, and certainly Canada is no exception.
Where do you think it's going, into 2023?
Well, the pace of change has really declined. So this is the biggest price adjustments occurred in the second quarter so far. I'm talking about what rear view mirror here. The pace of change in the third quarter that we just reported on was much less. And what we're seeing now is just modestly declining home prices. For all practical purposes, home prices are flat. So we believe the steepness of that price adjustment curve was early in the correction, and it's flattening now.
Okay.
Where it bottoms out is really a matter of consumer confidence. When people feel that interest rate increases are nearing the end of that tightening cycle.
Now, you and I have spoken about this in the past, about the supply issue in Canada, more precisely, the lack of supply. We're seeing numbers, immigration numbers growing. We're seeing, demographics changing, which, give us a good base for housing demand going into the future, right? And lack of supply. How is that going to all fit in together in the coming year, I guess?
We've got a real challenge nationally in cities large and small when it comes to supply. It's a little bit less of an issue in, say, Alberta than it is in Ontario, but it's an issue everywhere. And more policymakers and researchers are reaching that conclusion. If you go back again to the middle of the last decade, there was scapegoating on in public policy, in politics. It's the foreign speculators, or it's domestic home flippers, this sort of thing. We realize now that they represented a tiny fraction of the market. I mean, we basically shut down the foreign investment market during the pandemic with closed borders, and we saw the fastest rate of home price appreciation in history. So this is a domestic problem. CMHC came out with a study recently that says to make homes affordable, we need an additional 3 million homes by the end of the decade. And that's net additional, which is a huge number. Scotia Economics says to this date, we're 1.8 million homes short of where we would be if we were on the average of advanced economies in the world. So everybody's on board now. There's no serious politician or economist in the country that is claiming that we don't have a housing shortage in this country. The challenge is, can we align municipal, provincial, and federal initiatives to actually getting it done? I was really hopeful in 2021 and coming into this year. We were approaching 300,000 homes, which is a good number, not high enough. We actually need to get to 400,000. But of course, the reset has pushed some projects to the sideline. I think we're still on track for a good number of new homes, be they multis, condos, apartments, or detached homes. A good number, but not enough to catch up. It will remain one of the most important social issues in this country, along with healthcare and education, for, the balance of this decade anyway.
Yeah. So, Phil, one of the things I'm curious about, and I'd like to get your take on this, is, some of the issues in terms of affordability across the country. We all know about Toronto, and we all know about Vancouver, and how high the prices are in those major markets. Yet, we see probably half the prices in Alberta, right, in Calgary and Edmonton.
Yep.
Are you seeing a migration to Alberta from these centers because of prices? And one thing to keep a note, Jason Kenney, the former premier, I have to say former now, was recently out and about, especially in Toronto, trying to lure workers to come to Alberta because of affordability. What's happening there from your perspective?
We've seen a fundamental shift in interprovincial migration starting at the beginning of the pandemic. Traditionally, if you go back over the decades, there have been 2 or 3 provinces that have gained in population from the flow of people between provinces. So this is taking immigration off the table, just looking at Canadians migrating. And they were Ontario, Alberta, and BC. Sometimes Alberta would fall off the list, right? Fell off the list at the end of 2014 with the collapse of oil prices. So a little twitchy, but in general, those 3 provinces gained. That changed during the pandemic. And Ontario, our most populous province, became a net donor to the rest of the country. Where were the big gains? In order, Alberta, Atlantic Canada, grouping the provinces there, BC, and Quebec. Surprisingly, even Quebec gained people from Ontario. The rate of exit has slowed somewhat, but it has not stopped. And right now, Alberta has emerged from the pack as the #1 recipient of migrating Ontarians. Where that ends, we don't know right now. There's still many employers that are comfortable with remote workers.
Yeah,
a lot of business is generated in Southern Ontario. Big economic engine, but people don't mind having employees that work for anywhere. I have a daughter who accepted a management job at TELUS, and she lives in Toronto, and her team is spread across Canada. There's only one in TELUS, the headquarters, if you will, BC Alberta headquarters. Only one of the team is there. So TELUS, as an employer, is looking for people wherever they can get them. And they're not insisting that they come into the office because they don't even live in the same province. If that continues, I believe provinces like Alberta and Nova Scotia will be big gainers because the cost of living is lower and the living is easy. As a former Albertan, born and raised and lived there for many years, it's a nice place to live. And, the climate may be a little harsher than Southern Ontario, but not materially. And people are outdoorsy and, they adapt. So the question will come. When I started in this real estate industry, which was right around 2000, Calgary was the second most expensive city in Canada. Remember when I started doing public relations and speaking on the industry, it went Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver. Hard to believe, sorry, Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto. Toronto was the third most expensive. And now home prices in Calgary are half of what they are in Toronto and a little less than half of Vancouver. But that could change. You continue if the economic boom brought on by $100 oil continued, if the Alberta advantage continued to draw people from elsewhere in the country, you could see home prices in Calgary and Edmonton escalating at a rate above the national value. And, the invisible hand of the economy works its magic and the rate of migration would slow. But in the near term, we're going to see people continuing to migrate to lower cost parts of the nation.
All right, super. Thanks, Phil, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
All right, that was Phil Soper, President and CEO of Royal LePage. I'm Mario Toneguzzi, taking care of business on Canada's podcast network. Thanks for joining us today.